and gentlemen,
can I please have your attention? Can you dig it?
Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. It is good to be home from my various adventures in undisclosed European locations, and I am back at home, and we are going to get the party started. I have one of my favorite people here is past guest, but it's been a long time, and it's the first time I believe solo on here.
Yep.
Greg Lukianoff is the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, aka FIRE. When the ACLU dropped the ball about defending free speech, he picked it up and ran with it. He wrote the Coddling American Mind with Jonathan Haidt, and he's got a brand new book out with his co-author Ricky Schlott, which has a foreword by aforementioned Jonathan Haidt. The Canceling of the American Mind. Cancel culture undermines trust and threatens us all, but there is a solution. Greg, welcome back to the Remnant.
It's great to be here.
So we were chatting a little bit in the figurative green room, as it were, about how this is a tale is not quite as old as time, but as old as book publishing, of how the gods can sometimes just screw you with news events, right? I remember when Byron York had worked for years on a book, and it came out the week the Pope died.
Oh,
And this just happens to people, I mean, and I spent years working on Suicide West, and
great book, by the way.
Thank you very much. And my first interview on Fox, I had to explain in 3 minutes or less what it had to do, how it related to the latest Kanye West story. So this is no way to run a serious country, but it is the country we've been stuck with.
Yeah.
So why don't we start with my first and favorite question for book authors? What's your book about?
Sure. Yeah. No, it's we've tried to get across three things. One, we use a tremendous amount of data and examples. First of all, we're just trying to prove cancel culture is not just real. It's happening on a historic scale that they're going to be studying in 100 years. And I say this as a First Amendment lawyer with a particular interest in censorship history. And there are mass censorship incidents all throughout American history where lots of people get in trouble at the same time, usually. But they're almost always during national security crises and this kind of stuff.
Right.
Cancel culture has none of this. And we define cancel culture as being the uptick in campaigns to get people fired, deplatformed, punished for speech that would be protected under the First Amendment. Now, we explain a little more of that in the appendix. We're talking about under sort of public employee law. So it doesn't mean that any opinion is protected. It means that you have to do sort of a balancing, et cetera. And the culture of fear that resulted from that giant uptick. And we show that, it's a bigger number of professors fired than were even during McCarthyism, and nothing even close. And that was before the law was established, by the way. The law was only established between 57 and 73. And there's been nothing even slightly close to the number of professors getting canned due to their speech that's been happening in the last 10 years. The second part, which is actually kind of the most fun part of it in a way, and the one that's probably the most useful for your future arguments on the interwebs, is to get people to understand cancel culture as just the meanest part of a dysfunctional way of arguing, that a way of winning arguments without winning arguments. That essentially you can try to convince people, you can try to persuade them, you can use charts and graphs and logic, or you can scare them to death that if they disagree with you, they're going to lose their jobs and their lives are going to be ruined. But we try to situate that in a larger approach to frankly BS ways to argue, and we take the reader through the kind of techniques that both the right and the left share. So we talk about what we call something called the obstacle course first, which is like standard logical fallacies, the minefield, which are all the kind of ad hominem type things both right and left do. I mean, everyone calls everyone grifter, for example, which is just an accusation of bad faith. But then we get into the efficient rhetorical fortress on the right, which is a very simple system that allows you to dismiss liberals, experts, journalists, not that they shouldn't be dismissed sometimes, and for the particularly hard right, anyone who disagrees with Trump. But on the left, you have what we call the perfect rhetorical fortress, which is because it developed on in academia, it's just layer after layer of ways to get out of actually having to address someone's argument, largely based on identity. But it actually turns out if you follow that down the rabbit hole, none of that exercise even mattered, because if you are, like a trans person of color and you have the wrong opinion, then you're especially dismissed as having internalized transphobia, misogyny, racism, whatever. And that's only halfway through the number of ways that they can dismiss you, on the left. And then the final part is to try to start figuring out what the solutions could be. And I want your listeners to be clear here. I am under no illusion this is an easy fix. I think that you need to figure out ways to address this problem, from parenting to K through 12 to higher ed to corporations everywhere. And but the first thing is to get academia, for example, or K through 12 to even see that there's a problem. And the frustrating thing is that they seem constitutionally incapable of admitting that there's a problem on their side.
All right, so I want to get to that in a little bit, because I've had some epiphanies in the last couple of weeks. But let's why don't you sort of explain? So it's funny because I wrote this book called Tyranny Cliches, which was a terrible title. It sounded like a steroidal style guide, right? And the subtitle was How Liberals Cheat in the War at Ideas. And stand by, I think, almost everything in the book still. But if I had to do it over again, first of all, I'd get a different title. But second of all, I would just do How People Cheat in the War of Ideas, because the last 10 years has really kind of changed my view about the intellectual consistency and good faith of a lot of people on my team, such as it is. I mean, there are plenty of people of good faith and intellectual consistency on my side, as there are on the other side. But man, are they drowned out in the age of social media by other people and the age of cable news. And so I've become such a committed both sideser in recent years. But we should get back to that in a second. But why don't we work through, like, walk me through some of examples of the kind of the minefield, the impenetrable rhetorical fortress. What are some examples of all that, so people get a better sense of what we're getting at here?
So the minefield, for example, can be things like some minimization, which is a tactic that even when you get people might want to sound reasonable by saying, there's just a laughable quote from Adam Gurry at one point, the son of the great Martin Gurry, saying that he thought when he saw the numbers of professors fired in an early iteration of our Scholars Under Fire database, when you're talking about, 150, I think at that point, he said, well, any other problem, this is such a small number that any other problem in society would be considered effectively solved if the numbers were that low. And I'm like, okay, you could have just admit, nothing about the history of academic freedom. I started working after 9/11. I actually landed in Philadelphia at 9:10 a.m. on 9/11. Wow. To start working at Fire. And there were about 17 attempts to get professors fired for speech relating to either the Iraq War or 9/11. That's bad, by the way. And about 3 of them resulted in professors getting fired. But all 3 of those firings were, 2 of them actually explicitly exonerated the free speech rights and academic freedom rights of those professors. So Ward Churchill, for example, the guy who said that the people in the World Trade Center had it coming, he was actually fired for gross academic misconduct, which he really did. So, that's not a threat to academic freedom. Samuel Arian, who was originally charged for saying death to Israel in a video from the 1980s, he became famous due to Bill O'Reilly, was eventually fired for the fact that he had actual ties to Islamic terrorism groups, including the Muslim Brotherhood, I believe. And then the third one was someone who devoted a substantial portion of her technical writing class to condemning the Iraq War. And in that case, it's just like, no, you weren't teaching your class, which is very well established. If you're a physics teacher and you devote your class to your opinions on abortion, they can can you because you're not doing your job. So 3 were fired, none of them actually on standard academic freedom grounds. Now we're talking about almost 200. And you have to go all the way back to McCarthyism to see numbers anywhere near that. And even McCarthyism is not even close to 200. Even with decades to look into it, you're talking about maybe between 100 and 150. But at the time of McCarthyism, which is 11 years, by the way, and we're only 9.5 years into cancel culture, initially when they did a research of it, they found about 62 or 63 professors fired for communist beliefs. They had up to about 90 for kind of like beliefs in general, and a couple more that they usually round to around 100. And when you're talking about 200 professors being fired, and worse, by the way, 1/6 of professors. So we know this is also an undercount because there's a million different ways to get rid of professors now that nobody will ever hear about at all. And 1 in 6 professors, from one of our surveys, said that they've been investigated or threatened with investigation for their speech, for their academic freedom, which is an insane number. About 9% of students say the same thing, which is completely like that. There isn't anything you can even vaguely compare this kind of scale to. So in terms of minimization, so Adam saying that this is tiny. It's just kind of like, it just shows you don't know anything about the history of academic freedom. Like the American Association of University Professors did an entire issue on the firing of Stephen Salita. One firing, a bad one, and fire was involved in it, but nonetheless, one firing was considered to be a very big deal. And now we are so wildly beyond that. So when you get to the ad hominem, the what we call the minefield, the most common one there, one of the ones is just simply making things up, and this is something that Jesse Singal deals with all the time. Is people will just make up claims that he's done horrible things in real life to trans people,
right,
with no justification whatsoever. But we also talk about the accusations of bad faith, which is also one of the most common ones, which is grifter. And I always love it when people call David French, for example, a grifter. And I'm like, David graduated from Harvard in the mid 90s. He had to work hard to not become an incredibly wealthy lawyer.
Yeah.
he decided to go nonprofit. But the most useful one so far, in the tactic that both right and left share, is what we call hypocrisy projection. And that is when someone only cares about one side of the political fence getting censored, but then immediately assumes, usually without checking, that everyone else is actually the hypocrite. And this happens all the time with fire, both from the right and the left, although admittedly more from the left, where someone will on Twitter, be like, we have this case and this professor on the left is getting in trouble. Well, crickets from fire, or crickets from the people who signed the Harper's letter. And sometimes they literally will be linking to an article in which we are quoted. There was one example when someone did this, when it's like, that thing you're passing around is actually a records request from fire. So they do such minimal research because it hurts their primitive brains too much to imagine that, oh, maybe I'm the hypocrite. Maybe actually these people are being consistent, but they don't bother to check. They don't update their priors. So that's hypocrisy projection, and once you start looking for it, you'll see it all over social media.
I get called a grifter a lot, right?
You?
Me and David get called grifters.
I guess that shouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, dispatch gets called grifting, all this kind of stuff. There's this widespread to the extent that Jackass is sending you emails and tweets and what it constitutes a significant sample of something, which it remains unclear. But there's a bunch of people out there who have internalized this idea that, like, I quit Fox News in protest to make money, which is a very strange kind of like thing. That I cut off the ability to give speeches to right-wing groups for the rest of my life to enrich myself, that kind of thing. And
agreed.
Yeah, just naked greed. And so the problem I have, though, with your point, which I agree with entirely, is that people hurl around phrases like grifter or conservative ink, which is something that people on both sides of the divides on the right accuse the other of being part of. But my problem with this is that some people actually are grifters.
Sure. Oh, no.
Right. And so you get into this thing where you, like, whenever I'll accuse Charlie Kirk, who has like multiple houses and has made millions of dollars bilking old people by convincing them that he's what young people are like, or Jerry Falwell Jr., making millions from people, convincing them that he's this passionate Christian, except when he's watching his wife have sex with the pool boy.
Not weird.
That somehow I have no right to criticize these people or say anything because I'm a grifter too, kind of thing, right? And so there's this thing in Confucianism called the rectification of the names, which we can come back to in a second. But like I agree with you descriptively, but part of my problem is that like we still need to be able to use some of these words actually have meaning. It's like oftentimes you'll hear, various NGO type groups talk about how, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, right?
Yeah.
Which is true. That's sometimes true. It's also true that just one man is sometimes correct for calling someone a terrorist, and the other guy is wrong for calling them a freedom fighter.
Right.
And I just think, so like this is part of the problem is when we get so meta, sometimes you lose sight of the fact that both sides can formulaically argue the same way without it being without it making the case that both sides are wrong. Just one side is actually using the words correctly and the other side isn't.
Yeah.
Or one individual side is a wrong word for this, right?
We address this actually very early on in the book. And in Coddling the American Mind, we talk about the three great untruths, which is essentially this idea. That's my book with John Haidt that you mentioned. And the idea there is there are three ideas that are such terrible advice that go so much against both ancient wisdom and modern psychological thinking that if you believe them, you're going to be miserable. And the first three that we talk about is what doesn't kill you make you weaker, always trust your feelings, and life is a battle between good people and evil people. They sound initially maybe somewhat attractive, but when you think about them, they're a road to nowhere. And in this one, we have a fourth great untruth, which is no bad person has any good opinions. This kind of very primitive way of arguing. And one of the things that we point out, is that there's nothing about being a terrible person that necessarily means you're wrong. For that matter, you can be a grifter and be right about something as well. But and the reason why you got to point this out is because a lot of modern debates, even if it deserves that name, a lot of modern cancel culture is about I can prove you're a bad person, and therefore every opinion you have is wrong. And I always use the example of I use Rousseau a lot. I can also use Marx. Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Karl Marx were awful people. Like they Marx was a horrible racist and anti-Semite. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was just an awful person. Preached the value of childhood and then gave the 6 kids he had with his mistress, who he wouldn't marry, to orphanages. Was awful to David Hume, betrayed all his friends, just a terrible person. That doesn't mean you can outright dismiss all of his philosophy, and there are parts of Rousseau that I actually think are worth arguing. The general will thing I think is monstrous and horrifying, but it doesn't mean you but that's on its own substance. So a couple things on Grifter. One, if it gets used to basically say never listen to this person again, you might be dealing with someone who is being shady, but it doesn't mean that they're always wrong. Two, I do bristle at how lightly and easily it's used when people know nothing about somebody. Like the fact that it will just come up before anyone's done any research. With regard to Charlie Kirk has an interesting role in the book. Turning Point USA is an organization that Fire has routinely had to defend on campus because their students get in trouble all the time. And I've met a lot of their students, and to be fair, a lot of their students are great. We had a case up at Emerson College. I
believe that. That's true. Yeah.
We had a case up at Emerson College where students put up signs that said China kind of sus, which means China's kind of suspicious, with a flag of China on it to make it really clear they're talking about the Communist Party. The group itself was largely Asian, and then they got immediately accused of anti-Asian hate speech, for what they were doing when it was very clearly directed at the country and the Communist Party. So we've defended them very proudly. But the Turning Point USA scholar database thing that they do, the professor watch list, they have, first of all, they have the right to do that, to call out professors they don't like. But when it actually gets to what looks more like instructions on how to get this person fired, we have an issue with that. We think that that's actually something that you can't really claim to be, a big proponent of liberalism if you're actually, trying to get professors fired for speech that you don't like, particularly on the thin kind of research they usually do at Turning Point USA. So yeah, grifters absolutely do exist, but I do get mad when people. This is a trend that actually really does anger me. People will say this, and even people I like in a lot of other cases. Well, the free speech warriors aren't good on this case. They're total hypocrites on freedom of speech. And I'm like, no, you're describing people who aren't free speech warriors, and nobody actually ever seriously thought they were. If you're talking about Charlie Kirk, if you're talking about Milo Yiannopoulos, those aren't actual free speech people. Those are people who just are partisan to their core. Every time I hear this, I'm like, no, actually, if you look at basically all of us who actually work in the business of First Amendment and freedom of speech, it's a very consistent business. Like we largely agree on which cases are and aren't. No, not always. But the how it's used to how the existence of ideologues who just mention free speech sometimes gets used to impugn the entire working free speech field drives me nuts.
Yeah, I mean, this is a point David makes often, is that there are actually very few committed free speech people.
Yeah.
It's just that anytime there's a big free speech argument, half the country's on one side and half the country's on the other side. And so whichever side doesn't want the speech banned or punished or whatever uses the professional free speech people as their sort of avant-garde to, their praetorians to make the arguments for them.
Yeah.
So let's go back to the academic freedom stuff.
Yeah.
This is partly devil's advocate kind of stuff, but I'm also, my contempt for the larger social milieus of a lot of these elite universities is pretty high these days. And so just on a level setting thing, I also come from a very anti-communist family and anti-communist upbringing. And
my grandfather fought the Bolsheviks, so yeah, I usually win that argument.
I will often make the case that let's put it this way. You talk about how this is the worst it's been since the McCarthy period. I
have a feeling I know where you're going, and I think we're actually going to agree on this. But go on.
And I don't want to be like I don't want to be accused of violating the rules, the argumento ad minimization thing.
Yeah.
But if you look in the grand context of American history or world history or Western history, however you want to look at it, there were some bad things done during the McCarthy period in the United States.
Yep.
But there are certain people from my sort of background who will say, okay, so you're saying it's the worst since McCarthyism. Well, McCarthyism was actually wildly overblown as a terrible thing.
Yep.
So why is that such a big deal? It's sort of like, just for whatever reason it pops into my head, Jesse Jackson used to go around in the 90s, in the late 80s, saying that DC statehood is now the number one most important civil rights issue in America. And I always used to say, well, if that's the case, then civil rights is no longer a major problem in the United States.
I was like, whoa.
It's like saying, the inability to get good takeout is now the number one nutritional problem in America. Well, then we've solved nutrition as a major problem, right? And so, explain to me, just as if I'm a total stranger, why it is that because it's fine to say someone doesn't know anything about academic freedom, the history of academic freedom, but these numbers still sound like, given any other industry, people getting fired for saying stupid things. Or losing their jobs for saying bad things. And sometimes I don't think what they said is bad. So I'm not trying to make that point. I'm just trying to say that like if you were in the PR industry and you said stupid stuff, you could get fired. Why is the benchmark of McCarthyism such an argument settler in your mind? And why should a normal person think this is so important?
The benchmark of McCarthyism is a good comparison in a number of ways, because generally, when you're arguing about people who don't want to imagine that cancel culture is real, they'll say that the numbers aren't large, and you can point out that it's 3 times as many professors fired for communism than were fired for communism at the time, and twice as many.
Right. They might even say, look, it's not like it's McCarthyism. You say, whoa, contraire. In fact, it's worse than McCarthyism.
Yeah.
Right.
And the one in, and to be clear, we know that because the overall stats in the book, and we start from 2014 and we finish in July of last year because we have to stop the research at some point. Our editors were mad that we were still making those changes at the very last minute, but we wanted to get it, as updated as we could and still have it in the book. It's about 1,000 professors targeted. About 2/3 of them punished in some way, about 200 fired. And we know that's a wild undercount because, like I said, 1 in 6 professors said they've been investigated, and you can't actually, poll the professors who have been fired. There are bias-related incident programs. There are literally secret hearings, which sounds conspiratorial, but read Ann Applebaum or Laura Kipnis, and we are aware of these cases at Fire. So, my overall take on McCarthyism, and it's something that there was a chapter in the book initially that was a history chapter that was just a little bit too boring, that we decided to take out. And I'm now actually breaking into pieces and doing at my Substack called The Eternally Radical Idea. And here's my blasphemous opinion on McCarthyism, but at the same time, it has to be said. There were actual spies in the United States.
Right.
And the evidence against people like Julius Rosenberg is overwhelming.
Right.
David Greenglass confessed. His wife confessed. Harry Gold confessed. We know Klaus Fuchs, who was an immigrant from Germany, but spied on the British. Kim Philby, of course, bragged about it. Also British. And of course, Ted Hall. We now know Ted Hall was a spy. And what's funny is people pretend like this is, it's still a debate about whether or not we knew about it. I'm like, no, the evidence at the time was very strong. What they weren't allowed to reveal was that we'd broken the Soviet code, and that we actually now had the whole Venona documents, which came out in the 90s, which are overwhelming. But then the thing that makes it particularly ridiculous to claim these people were innocent was the fact that we now actually have memoirs from their Soviet handlers confirming all sorts of details they couldn't have known otherwise. So it's no, I'm sorry. And the question with regards to Ethel, that some of the agents who were involved in that didn't think Ethel deserved the electric chair. They didn't think she deserved to die. It's not that they thought she was innocent. Because it's clear also from the record that she knew what her husband was doing. And of course, David Greenglass's wife said that Ethel tried to actually recruit her for the communists. So, and I always make this point. Arguments and British had helped Super Hitler, as we call him as Russians, like someone who had who arguably murdered more people than even Hitler. I think they're moral equivalents at minimum. A bomb that could kill everybody on the entire planet. That's insane, and you'd be freaked out too.
Right.
And so I even read the Oppenheimer book, and I definitely came away. Oppenheimer was innocent. He was a patriotic American by the end of it. But the idea that people wouldn't be freaked out by the fact his brother was a communist, his wife used to be a communist, he admitted to being with every communist front group, he admitted to being with every communist front group on the West Coast. I don't blame people for being freaked out as well. So there was real reason to panic in the early 50s. And also higher ed didn't exactly just say, you have to go because we don't like communism. A lot of the rationale for firing these professors is you are too doctrinaire, you're too stubborn, and you're too rigid in your belief in this stuff. You're just indoctrinating students, and therefore we can ask you to go. You're ideologues, not teachers. So that's a way to say that kind of the current situation is crazier than McCarthyism because there isn't a national security threat. We didn't just enter a period. There's no allegation that any of these people might actually be security risks at all.
Right.
And this comes out in the data, by the way. There was a poll conducted in that massive study, and the number of professors who said that they were self-censoring because of the Red Scare was 9%. And to be clear, 1 out of 10 is bad. Yeah. 1 out of 10 professors saying they're self-censoring is bad. We did the poll more recently, and the ones who say they're self-censoring, in their papers, it's several times that. The ones who are saying they're censoring overall was about 90%. It's not a perfect comparison given the questions were given. But, by every standard, people are more afraid of speaking their minds today than they were during McCarthyism. And by the way, this is also happening when there's essentially no viewpoint diversity in a lot of higher ed, particularly elite higher ed. So, by a lot of measures, it's decidedly worse today. And it doesn't follow the normal, like it really is kind of alone in history as this very strange movement where there's not some massive national security crisis, and professors are just getting fired for being not ideologically pure.
Yeah. Okay. So again, I do want to move on for this, but it's something I kind of just want to tease out from you because I can just imagine relatives of mine asking me these questions. So I get the benchmark. I agree with you entirely about, the McCarthyism part of it, but I think a lot of normal people think that like universities should just teach people the college equivalent of the 3 R's, right? So it's, basic liberal arts education, if it's a liberal arts education, open debate, all of that kind of stuff. But at the same time, and I think most normal people, if they actually knew the extent of the garbage that is sort of being sort of indoctrinated, the sort of DEI statement, the universe of things, which I want to talk about, but they would be pretty disgusted. I think the recent revelation of the Israel stuff is going to be a watershed moment for a lot of people. Yeah. But again, at the end of the day, like, let's imagine for the sake of argument that universities were much more like 1950s universities, even never mind that William F. Buckley had a huge problem with 1950s universities. He wrote God and Man at Yale, right, to make them famous. But
a 3-to-1 liberal to conservative balance as opposed to a, infinity to one.
what liberal and conservative meant in 1950 was very different than what it means today too. So it's like there are a lot of different cross currents there. But let's just say that universities were much more normal right now, and that if you said crazy things on the left or the right, it could cost you your job. What is lost in that environment that should concern us outside of the ideal learning environment? Like what are the knock-on effects for America, for society? Yeah. What is the slippery slope argument? I'm not a big fan of slippery slope arguments, but what is like, other than to say it's unfair to individual people, and I'm always against unfairness to individual people, but like what are the larger stakes involved stipulating that all your numbers are right?
We know that all of our numbers are a minimum, essentially. Sure. like the cases that because you don't really learn that the people who point out that there's 4,000 schools in the country are just trying to minimize the issue, when it actually turns out about 200 schools educate about half the 4-year students in the country, and about 600 schools educate about 80%, and wildly disproportionately, the top 10 schools create our, forgive the expression, ruling class. And those schools, by the way, are the worst when it comes to cancel culture, when it comes to, and they lead the pack. I mean, Harvard finished dead last in our campus free speech ranking this year, completely on its own steam. People are kind of like, oh, that's some kind of like publicity stunt. Like, no, we did not actually expect it to finish dead last. By student polling and the number of professors who got canceled there. And I definitely would urge your readers to actually read the book and decide for themselves, because the examples that you're talking about, particularly when cancel culture, because we call it cancel culture from the left and the right, but when it comes from the left for professors, the stuff that can get you in trouble is nuts. And it actually has a very harmful effect on the entire country. When we talk about undermining trust in the subtitle, this is what we're getting at. So I use the example of Carol Hooven at Harvard. She's an evolutionary biologist. She did a lot of field work, checking out testosterone levels in chimpanzees and discovering like when at different times it was higher, and all fascinating stuff. Her book T is a beautiful read, and she's a absolutely brilliant scholar. She wrote this book. She went on Fox News to talk about it because a lot of other places were, a little nervous about the subject matter. And she very compassionately says we should be kind to trans people. We should be compassionate towards them. We should use their pronouns. But biological sex is real. Right. And we pretend it's not at our peril. It can have gross harm medically. It can also lose a lot of people who could otherwise be allies and friends if you try to pretend it's not. And there was immediately a DEI staffer, who blew the whistle on this as being transphobic and horrible, behind the scenes, I suspect, or maybe independently, students, but a lot of times administrators help these cancel culture movements along. Students, started filing petitions on change.org saying that she needed to go or that she needed to be disciplined. They refused to work her class. Her friends turned on her. The university didn't have her back. Kind of the only person who really did have her back was Steve Pinker, who's on our advisory council, who's very good on this stuff. And she eventually felt forced out, and that, by the way, that isn't even in our 200 firings, because she just got so depressed that she decided to leave, because it seemed like, and she couldn't get, TAs to work for her class. And meanwhile, what Harvard should have done was say, no. We don't need administrators actually saying that there's an orthodoxy here. She has every right to say her opinion, and that we can't have someone forced out because we're too chicken to say, no, TAs actually have to work her class. Like they can't just decide what opinions they don't like, because that creates an orthodoxy. And so that's bad for Carol individually, but it's worse for society for this reason. If you look, people aren't stupid. And if they look up to what's going on at a place like Harvard, and they see that someone at such a fancy institution got forced out simply for saying biological sex is real, the next time someone comes up and says, from Scientific American, for example, saying, no, biological sex is on a spectrum, not gender, but biological sex, what they currently are trying to argue, no one's going to believe them, because they realize, oh, you wouldn't tell us otherwise, because last person who tried that lost their career. And it's right. Particularly intense in all of the hot button issues. But like, I think there were like 3 different articles that were actually making some common sense points, about clusters of young women deciding that they were trans, rapid onset gender dysphoria. That was retracted. I think that was Michael Bailey. There were 2 other articles, one about how to actually treat gender dysphoria without transition. A fascinating article. That was retracted as being transphobic. So basically, it completely destroys trust in expertise, and it kind of should, because a single professor getting in trouble, for having the wrong opinion sends the message that everyone has to conform or potentially lose their jobs. And when you're talking about hundreds of examples of this, because again, like it's more like 650 when it comes to actual punishments, that's going to lead people to not have a world of common facts.
Yeah, see, I'm glad I pushed it, because I agree with you. I think that the way to look at academia, broadly speaking, particularly elite academia, is that it's basically the truth industry.
Supposed to be, yeah.
Right. And I'm a Hayek guy. I really love Jonathan Rauch's Constitution of Knowledge.
Yep.
And if you didn't like it, then I have to go reread it. It's like, what did I miss?
No, I love it. I love John.
I remember in Hunt for Red October, where the Russians are getting ready to invade Western Europe, and the head of I can't remember if it was the the head of Russia or just the head of the military. He decides first thing he's got to do is hang some generals for lying in the reports, because he needed to know actually the state of readiness of things. And the point was, you only need to hang a couple for everyone to get the message, right? Yeah. And whether it's the trans stuff or 1,000 other things, truth is its own defense.
Yeah.
And if you get into this thing where it doesn't mean you in interpersonal social life, you don't always have to tell all the truth. And there's such things as white lies and all that kind of stuff. And if someone asks you, does this dress make me look fat? You can say no without like violating liberalism or the First Amendment.
Right.
But like when it comes to things, particularly in the sciences, where you let ideology or conformity or all that kind of stuff get in the way, the ripple effects of that are incredibly pernicious. And that's where I think this stuff, that's why I think it matters more than like life is difficult for a bunch of pampered people who live in ivory towers kind of thing. Not to say that that's a fair way to characterize it, but you get my point. So we established you have my sympathies for trying to come out with a book in the middle of like the what may be World War III. So whatever.
We did great though. We were on a lot of the biggest podcasts, including Lex Friedman. We for the week we did about as well as we could. I had a big profile about me, which made me, by the way, incredibly uncomfortable in Politico, but nonetheless was good for the book. But yeah, I think that we did the best under the circumstances, but not an ideal week.
The reason I bring it up, and this podcast is quite good at moving books. So, buy
the book for your friends who are skeptics that cancel culture is even real or matters.
There you go.
I keep on saying it makes a great stocking stuffer.
So I teased this earlier, but I've had some epiphanies this week. So I've been doing the sort of the sort of right wing, the sort of conservative critique of language policing for a long time.
Yeah.
Sort of the John Leo tradition of conservative stuff, the stuff that you've done a lot of, that I've always sort of had fun with, because some of it is so stupid and so silly that it's kind of fun to play with. And it's one of those areas of writing for me that has always been enjoyable, because the stakes seem so low in a certain way, and mockery is sometimes the best way to approach all of this stuff. But I got to say, like, I'm working through my anger on some of this, because it seems to me not unreasonable to say that if you've spent 10 years or whatever it's been in some DEI office or some other, administrative position at a university, talking about how words are violence, how using the wrong pronoun is violence, and that I was just going through the Brandeis list of offensive terms. They try to get rid of the word trigger, because trigger was sort of either related to firearms, or it threatened immediate harm that made people nervous.
Trigger could be triggering, was the argument.
Right. And so it seems to me that if you spend a lot of time making those kinds of arguments and developing whole seminars with reading materials based on these kinds of arguments about hostile environments based upon words, and then you get your panties in a bunch and are incapable of criticizing. I'm not talking about punishing, right? I'm just talking about like criticizing people who say things like gas the Jews, or support, or say they're exhilarated and delighted when they see paragliders go in and slaughter children in their beds. And your response to that is full of euphemism and both sidesism and sort of denial of agency of any kind. It makes it feel to me like they were never actually serious about their stated reasons for why they were doing that stuff. And it was really much more a matter of dominance. If I can make you say birthing person instead of mother, then I'm proving my authority over you.
Yes.
And that's it. And so it all of a sudden it makes a lot of that project, which I always gave them more of a benefit of the doubt of just being silly and misguided, to really think of it as kind of sinister. Because if you can't see the violence inherent in the system, to quote Monty Python, when you're talking about people saying, the only good Jew is a dead Jew on Cornell discussion platforms, if that's causing you, Jesuitical panic about difference splitting and angels on the head of a pin, but you are 100% all in and forcing people to use pronoun stuff or get rid of, you can no longer use a phrase like master bedroom.
Yeah.
Because of the terror that the word master supposedly evokes in some people. It just makes it seem much more of an Orwellian totalitarian project to me than I was treating it as for the last few years.
Yeah. No, I think, the only good thing I would say that I think came out of the last couple of weeks with regard to higher education is there might be sufficient anger and disgust to consider the kind of large scale reforms that probably need to happen, and consider some of the alternative institutions. University of Texas at Austin, is trying to set up a proper liberal arts college that actually has viewpoint diversity, that actually allows freedom of speech, that actually gets out of some of the issues that create such problems, like the residences will be privately, managed in a different way, because residence life has become kind of, in a lot of ways, like the priests of the new religion. I I was even kind of surprised, and I've been doing this 22 years, about how unreflectively vicious the view that the Palestinians are always right is on some campuses. And I knew that had kind of become a dogma in many circles, certainly being out in California. The amount of anti-Semitism I see when I go to, and to be clear, anti-Semitism I see when I go to California, not just anti-Zionism, always blows me away. And also relating to the book, I mean, people should understand that cancel culture, this stifling environment is one of the reasons why, because a lot of these presidents are very pro-Israel. They are, and surely we're completely disgusted by Hamas. And so when donors come in, I think the AUP, came out with something condemning, you should cut all ties to donors who are demanding statements from presidents. And I'm like, yeah, if they're demanding statements from presidents that presidents don't believe, that's one thing. But what they're saying is, you coward, you are too afraid of your most radical students, administrators, and faculties to say what you really think on a disgusting, monstrous attack. This is insane. So in this case, the cowardice of university presidents in this case really shone through. And two, just the environment is so hostile that even university presidents, to be fair, have some reason to be freaked out if you take the wrong side on a holy issue like this. And even for the students themselves, I have a pretty minimal sympathy for students who actually immediate reaction was, this is all Israel's fault. Well, the murder and raping is still going on.
Right.
That I don't have a great deal of sympathy for them. But they almost certainly grew up in an environment where it's Israel's fault was always the right answer. And that was something that was inculcated to a large degree by adults. And one of the reasons why they could really get the impression that kind of everybody agrees with that is people were too scared of getting canceled to even argue with them. So they got a false sense of the popularity of this belief. But does this leave me thinking higher education, particularly elite higher education, can be saved? I question it. I think that I talk a lot about, like if we had some insanely difficult exam you could take to show that you read every single book in a humanities curriculum before everything went social justice fundamentalist, that would be a better way to figure out you're getting the best, brightest, hardest working person. Because right now at Harvard, and Jonah, this kills me. After writing Coddling the American Mind, employer after employer came to me in Haidt and said, oh yeah, no, like we're having big problems with the new graduates, particularly from the elite schools. They show up, and even though we're a nonprofit that helps people, apparently we're the oppressor. And we have to close down work for tiny little tiffs that are interpersonal conflicts that usually I don't want to have to work with that person I slightly disagree with. And we're not hiring from Ivies anymore. And I always finish it with, do me a favor. Tell the world that. Yeah. Because that actually might be the slap in the face that some of these institutions need. And the answer is almost always no. We won't say that. But what you're getting right now, and I pick on Harvard a lot because again they earned their dead last position on the FIRE campus free speech rankings. The average. Also,
if you're going to talk smack about baseball, you talk about the Yankees a lot, right? You pick the one that everyone. They're emblematic of the entire elite thing, even though there may be, you could do the same thing with Yale, but Harvard works as a good, you're going to pick an example, right?
Yeah, well, we have a whole chapter on Yale in the book because we saw so many bad cases at Yale. Next one, we should probably have a whole chapter on Harvard, although Harvard makes numerous appearances. Stanford, my alma mater, doesn't exactly cover itself in glory in the book as well. But what you end up with is 45% of the white students at Harvard are either kids of professors, legacy admissions, or sports. Stanford at least is Pac-10. Anyway, the average grade point average, and I can't go over this, is a 3.8. That's a summa or magna cum laude, depending on how you judge that. So what is the product you're getting from Harvard now? You're getting someone who could have just skated in, because they're a third generation legacy and a major donor's kid. They might have been happy to get their 3.6. And so you might be getting a kid who's not nearly as smart as someone who went to a big state school, who didn't learn all that much because they didn't have to. I can attest that, at Stanford, it's almost impossible to fail out. And you're also probably getting someone who might show up and say, that that IT guy you have who is brilliant and slightly aspy, he occasionally sounds kind of conservative. So maybe you should get rid of him too. And by the way, I don't just want, it's not just my opinion that the Palestinians are always the good guys in these fights. I think this needs to be the entire corporate opinion. I think we need to come out with a statement saying the Palestinians are entirely right. So I think there's lots of reasons to not hire from elite colleges for a long time coming. And I think that if that actually becomes the norm, that's when real reform becomes possible.
Yeah, no, that's the other part. I'm glad you brought that up too, because that's the other part when I was pressing you on the why it matters stuff, is that the kids coming out, like we've talked about this before, Coddling American Mind is great on this, political correctness, depending on how you define it, has been around for a century. In some ways, shibboleth formation is inherent to all elite castes, right? It's something that they do. In-group, out-group. Here's the language that shows you're part of us, whether it's the language of the French, of the court or whatever, right? So it's a very old phenomenon, and it's a very human phenomenon. Yep. What's different is that on college campuses, the PC stuff or woke stuff or whatever, there have been professors like that forever. What's different are students, right? And then this gets from the Coddling American Mind stuff is you raise kids with hyper safetyism. You raise kids that are taught that if they're in a challenging intellectual environment, that somehow it's the environment that's wrong, and that anything that makes you feel unsafe is therefore illegitimate or dangerous. You're going to get those are the kinds of students that the crazy left-wing social engineering professors have been waiting for, because they tell them, see, here are all these facts about history that make you uncomfortable. That's why you shouldn't learn them anymore. And then they spill out of these sort of production lines into real America. And I got to say, I'm Gen X, right? I'm a co-owner of a company. I know lots of people. We talk shop with Gen X is the last good generation as far as I'm concerned. And
I think we're the only great generation.
Possible, very possible. And so many of the controversies that everyone gets their dresses over their heads about in what's going on in the New York Times, and people getting fired for this and getting fired for that, or why did someone cover this story that way? You go and talk to the people who are in management, and they'll say, yeah, it's the young people. It's the Gen X people, Gen X management, Gen X and boomer management of a lot of major media organizations, a lot of major companies in general. They're terrified of their younger staffers.
Yes.
And that's a direct result of the environment that you're talking about.
100%. And I hear this from the heads of because of books like Coddling, and because of the horrifying situations we've seen on campuses for a while, people are starting to get that FIRE really is genuinely nonpartisan, and that we defend everybody's freedom of speech. But there is something specially wrong in higher education. And we definitely have, heads of major liberal foundations reaching out to us. And I get told in confidence that they are afraid of their younger employees.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, well, probably should have admitted that to me, because I'm not exactly, that doesn't make you look really good. But I hear this all the time, that they are scared of their younger employees being so rigid. And that's one of the reasons why people compare this to something that behaves a lot more like a religion than just a simple point of view.
So this gets to something I teased earlier, is that I'm a committed both sideser, right? Mm-hmm. And so it makes all my fans on the left and right furious at me, because the I shouldn't say all of them. There are some in the clustered around the sort of center who understand liberalism properly understood, that there are problems on there are problems on both sides of the ideological divide, and they just but the problem is they manifest themselves differently.
Yes.
I think it's an entirely fair statement to say that if the right, broadly defined these days, had the kind of monopolistic control over higher ed, we'd probably still be seeing cancel culture. It would just manifest itself in a different way over different issues, perhaps. Or at least you would not lose business dealing with academic free speech issues. They would just be on different topics, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when I tell people I'm a both sides, but it's asymmetrical.
Yeah.
The left has control the commanding heights of the culture in Hollywood, in higher ed, in journalism, and a few other places. And so the way we're going to talk about the problem there is going to be different than the way we talk about the problem on the right. We haven't talked very much about the problem on the right. So in your mind, and in your book, what are the biggest threats to free speech, academic freedom, or free speech generally, coming from a rightward direction? Yeah.
Okay. So sometimes, I argue with people who only care about the threat from the right. And I do lots of, whenever I just did the David Pakman show, and no matter what I said, he's like, oh, but the real threat's from the right. And it's like, okay, sorry. That's not actually what our data shows in terms of proportionality. So, but I think that for people who really want to focus on the right, I should point out that of those 1,000 professors punished, 1/3 of them are initially targeted by the right. That, Turning Point USA, Fox News, etc. And sometimes those professors said those are cases where some of those professors did say some, pretty horrible things. There are also cases like Asheen Fanzi, who Fox News wrote up like he'd actually been consulting with the Ayatollah to advise him on where to attack in the United States. And it actually was a tweet of him saying, hey, Ayatollah Khomeini, someone the professor obviously knows is long dead. Here are cultural sites you can attack in the United States. The Kardashian residence, the Mall of America, basically making a joke that we don't have cultural centers, but like a kind of a cute, lame joke. And this got treated on the right as if he was literally advising Khomeini, and he lost his job. And this was right at 2020, I think at Babson College in Massachusetts. So there are truly bad and highly sympathetic examples of people being canceled from the right. There is a caveat there, though, by the way, is given how wildly disproportionate the management of higher ed is today, that usually, even though the pressure will come from off campus, the people actually doing the firing are often themselves on the left. So it doesn't completely wash the hands. I make the argument that if everybody on the left was still awesome on free speech, none of this would be possible. But unfortunately, that's long since passed. When it comes to, we have 3 chapters on censorship from the right. We actually have a whole chapter that's primarily, about people going after the media, particularly Trump going after journalists. I don't think we actually mentioned in your case in that, but we give a list of journalists that Trump has gone after. We talk about what state legislatures have done, and the most concerning state legislature by far is the Florida legislature. They've suggested things like reconsidering the defamation standard in New York Times v. Sullivan, which I just think, like, do you honestly think that will work out well for conservatives? Because you haven't really thought this through, if that's what you think. And there has been attacks on the curriculum in higher ed. Now, of course, when you get to K through 12 curriculum, that's an entirely different topic because the state actually does have power over K through 12 curriculum. And you can say that you hate what different red states have decided the curriculum should be in K through 12. But you have to remember that's always been a political battle about what's get taught. So, but in higher ed, one of the things that gets used to say that this isn't a problem on the left, it's just the right because legislatures are more powerful, are these attacks on curriculum in higher ed. But one thing, there's been one attack on curriculum in higher ed. That's the Stop Woke Act in Florida. Fire and the ACLU challenged it because it's laughably unconstitutional, and we defeated it. There's now a Stop Woke 2 that we'll be challenging again, and I think is equally as unconstitutional. We'll challenge it again. So I'd say that a lot of the threats coming out of legislatures is the main problem. I'd say that some of the problem is within the world of cable news and right-wing journalism. And those are the primary areas to be concerned about. But also, like I said, the attack on professors that comes from off campus, from right-wing groups are the main places of focus. But we do want to be clear here. we call this out, and Fire fights this stuff all the time. But there is no solving this problem, none, without the left taking some amount of stock of itself and saying, we've lost our minds. Like the liberals need to take on the progressives is usually the way,
Yeah.
or just disown them, because so many of the bad ideas, dysfunctional ideas, that also is, by the way, going to mean that they probably will find their future candidates completely unelectable, are coming from their side. And meanwhile, David writes about the idea that the sides have to fix themselves, and that making the point that the right has to deal with its, MAGA wing.
Just circling back to something you said earlier about presidents making statements about things. I am generally against all of these institutions,
Yes.
and not just higher ed. Like I found, was it George Floyd? The Black Lives Matter moment to be pretty creepy, in the sense that I'm one of those guys who's like Kramer and Seinfeld. I do not want to be made to wear the pin, right? And
I can't do that either.
and
But you support it. Yes, I do. Why aren't you wearing the pin? Because you're telling me to.
Right. And it's like, and every storefront had to put up some kind of BLM thing. Every company had to make a BLM statement. And I'm not saying that the statements were necessarily wrong, or anything like that. I think the actual BLM Foundation is not immune to the charge of grifter. But that's a conversation for another time. Yes. But the general sentiment of sort of acknowledging that we have a problem with police violence against African Americans and all that, that's fine. Even if we can have arguments about the statistics and all that, that's a perfectly fine sentiment. And it's fine to say it if you believe it, but the enforced conformity of it got so crazy. And my problem is that one of the downside, the downstream effects of this stuff is that when you force institutions to issue sweeping statements about specific events that have nothing to do with their mission, the next time there's an event and you don't give a statement of any kind, or you give a really bad statement, people can make inferences from it, right? And so, like, I don't think college presidents should be saying much about any of these kinds of things that don't affect their campus communities in some significant way. But if you're going to be in the business of doing that, and you say, well, but the Israel thing's complicated, people, like donors are allowed to say, well, wait a second. You leaned all the way in on this, but you have to be circumspect and like stay in your lane for that. That is a statement in and of itself. And I think it's fair for comment.
Oh, I actually completely agree, because Fire thinks the Calvin Report, which is the 1967 statement from University of Chicago, that the university itself is not the speaker, it's the forum for speakers, that it's the professors and students who they should be focusing on, and not be this, not be the decider itself. So we like that, but I've written probably the most cynical piece I've ever actually written, because I try to be an optimist, even though sometimes I feel like that's not rational to be an optimist on some stuff at this point. Even though we like the Calvin Report and we hope that schools will adopting it now because you're too cowardly to actually say the same kind of thing about a horrifying attack on civilians, children, elderly, etc., because you're afraid of your own employees and your own students, is something absolutely worth calling out. So I think one of the paths forward that someone suggested is like, listen, it is contemptible to comment on all these other things and not comment on this one. Comment on this one, then Calvin. Let's see if you can stick with it. And I wrote, at Fire, we can't actually just say, oh, you're committing to free speech and political neutrality now. We don't like that. We have to say, no, we hope you really mean it this time. But there's nothing stopping us from saying, this seems incredibly cynical, and my money is on. You stay with us for about 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And because this is something actually that I realized, I forget sometimes when you're in a field for such a long time, you kind of assume everybody knows the way it works. This is really predictable. When it's perceived as the threat to academic freedom and free speech comes from outside the campus, campuses circle the wagons. They scream academic freedom and free speech. Sometimes they'll mention McCarthyism. And they suddenly discover free speech when the threat is from outside. And by the way, that includes their own donors that they see as a threat from outside. But when the threat comes from inside, when it's students, marching on the president's office, when it's faculty, angry about something, and particularly administrators, they cave all the time. And of course, then they explain how differently this issue is. This issue is actually hitting them. I hold out some tiny bit of hope that maybe at least for some of these schools, they've been slapped in the face hard enough. They're going to be like, you know what, actually, political neutrality as far as, or institutional restraint, whatever you want to call it, is the new norm. And we really are going to not just defend free speech, but teach it. I have a little tiny itty bitty bit of hope for Stanford, partially because Jenny Martinez, the former dean of the law school, did a really good job standing up for political neutrality and academic freedom earlier this year, before October 7th. And maybe this is a change, because they actually, for that, they promoted her to provost. So that's a good sign too. Mm-hmm. I'm still skeptical that even they can pull it. And when it comes to places like, Yale and Harvard, I'll believe it when I see it. And by the way, it will take years of good behavior. And I have a feeling you're going to blow this in like 15 minutes.
All right. Just because I have you here and you this stuff, riddle me this. I know we're going over time, but just one last thing. So I was a young trustee on my college's board, and it was an interesting learning experience. And I know now, thanks to the highfalutin circles I travel in, I've gotten to know quite a few people on boards of very prestigious schools. Mine was not a particularly prestigious school. And the thing that I find sort of sociologically kind of fascinating is, and maybe there's a selection bias problem that I have here, so I'm not getting the right picture, but for the most part, a huge number of the people on these boards, they may be Democrats, maybe Republicans, that kind of thing. They may be moderate liberals, but they would never run their own businesses the way they allow these universities to be run. And I mean on sort of almost anything except maybe endowment management, because a lot of these schools are essentially huge hedge funds that run classes on the side. But like, there seems to be this kind of thing that's like, there's that scene in Wall Street where Michael Douglas is explaining that, the ultimate Veblen good is to be on the board of the Central Park Zoo, right? Or the Bronx Zoo, right? It's just like this feather in your cap. I get to say I'm on the board of Princeton. I get to say I'm on the board of Harvard or whatever. But the boards actually do not seem to exert much control over these universities. And so whenever I talk to people, whenever I meet people at donor this or whatever that, and I talk to them about, we talk about this a lot on the board, and they make it sound like if only we had power. And like, what is it in fact that college presidents actually have a lot of allies, or the administrators have a lot of allies on these boards, and they're just not the ones I happen to meet because they're the ones who come from, places that I wouldn't run into? I mean, like, but I don't know. I don't get it, because even like the left-wing DC lawyers I knew on the board when I served, they would never, defer so much to what essentially an employee was telling them. The way they do, it's like the second you have tweed jackets with elbow patches, you can't say anything wrong to these people, and it's just sort of fascinating to me.
Yeah, one thing that has been incredibly frustrating and bizarre is how many powerful people I talk to, like I mentioned, heads of foundations, former deans of law schools, former presidents of universities, and get told that they actually have no power, and that they're, a victim of their institutions being out of control, and there's not a lot they can do about it. And I'm like, okay, surely someone has some power somewhere in this chain. And if not, someone needs to actually figure out what's going wrong and fix that. But I also think I hear a lot of cowardice in that, to be honest. Like I do actually think a lot of people are thinking they don't have power, but it's like, no, you're saying that it would be too difficult and socially painful, which, by the way, is part of cancel culture, to exert any power, because, this is a constituency that knows tactically and strategically when to freak out, and particularly freak out early and often if it's a change you don't like. So I tend to think that some of this is a little bit BS. I do think a lot of schools have figured out ways to make their board of directors matter less. And that was one of the reasons why they try to have a tight control on who gets to be their bosses, which is messed up. But it's one of the things that makes this higher education problem so difficult to fix. And, you know, again, kind of like my hope here is that a lot of these students who are like, wow, my university has become incredibly anti-Semitic. I'm like, go to some of these new experimental schools, go to some of these other places, because I'm not really sure higher ed, particularly elite higher ed, will have any interest in fixing a damn thing unless the consequences are severe, and particularly to their reputation, because you can't starve them of money. They have infinite money. They don't think they have infinite money, but a lot of them essentially do. You know, as Malcolm Gladwell says, Princeton's almost become a perpetual motion machine in terms of how much money it has. And I'd say Harvard probably already is. But I do think that we do have a moment in front of us where we could rightfully demand some real change. But if we take the university word for it, that, oh, we're fixing it, and don't stop donating to them, don't yank our kids out, they're just going to keep on behaving like the massive, super rich mega corporations that get to decide who your ruling class is, who they actually are at the moment.
On that note, Greg Lukianoff, thanks again for coming on. The book is The Canceling of the American Mind with your co-author, Ricky Schlott. It's great stuff. I just started it recently, but I love Coddling the American Mind, and highly recommend all of it to everybody.
Thank you, Jonah.
Okay, so Greg Lukianoff has left the studio. I could have talked to him for about a while longer about a bunch of other things. He's got a good podcast voice, I got to say. And I'm sure there are many announcements I probably should be making. I can't think of them all, but one I can think of is that the Skiff, this sort of members-only podcast feed with members-only content, not the jackets. I'm sorry, I'm dating myself. Is up and running. And as I threatened, basically all AMAs for the Remnant are now going to be in there. And so we're going to do one in the next week or so. I haven't figured out the exact timing yet, but we want to do them, you know, either at the end or the beginning of every month. And so if you got questions, send them to the Remnant at thedispatch.com or Remnant at thedispatch.com. We set up emails going both ways in case I couldn't remember. I'm sort of like Joe Biden to the younger staff. They just try to make it easier so that when I have various spacey moments, there's no downside to it. So the Remnant at thedispatch.com or Remnant at thedispatch.com. Send your questions, comments, concerns. No, just send your questions, and questions that are well suited for an AMA, which, in case you didn't remember, stands for Ask Me Anything. And beyond that, thanks to Chris Starwald for subbing for me again. And thank you all for putting up with my Where in the World is Jonah Goldberg Travels. And please become a paid subscriber to The Dispatch. That's about it. I'll see you next time.
No, you won't. This is a podcast.